In this particular presentation, we're going to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, but try to be aware that at each step of the way in which we're moving, we're using pairs of books, pairs of figures, pairs of ideas. If you would like to put a concept over the pairedness, that concept is called, in our century, symmetry. And perhaps the best book ever written on it was written by a very humble, brilliant genius, mathematical genius named Hermann Weyl, W-E-Y-L, Weyl. Hermann Weyl. And his book called Symmetry was published by the Nuclear Physics series of Princeton back when nuclear physics was just brand new around 1946. The notion of symmetry as a 20th century idea, very, very powerful, was formulated by Niels Bohr in his development of nuclear physics in the quantum physics quality of having complementarity. And Bohr got this from reading Lao Tzu, that the yin-yang balance, which is always occurring mutually, that ancient Chinese idea was brought by Bohr into atomic theory at a time when atomic theory was dominated by a medieval hierarchical quality of ideation that was completely inadequate. The idea of atomic structure, before Bohr developed his work, had its basis on the old Ptolemaic idea that you have something at the center and then you have rings and orbits around, and that in this hierarchical target kind of quality, that this is what reality was made out of. And so one looked to find out what was the thing at the center. But the idea of trying to find out what was the thing at the center went completely out of fashion in terms of exacting intelligence around 400 years ago. A man named Kepler, Johannes Kepler, discovered that when you really did the mathematics right, and you correlated the mathematics with exacting physiological observation, that there are no things at the center. There are no things, and there are especially no things at the center. And so he developed a kind of a dynamic mathematics to describe the solar system, which was no longer a sun as a main thing at the center, and planets moving in little shells around that, so that the solar system was no longer a target at all. And this happened about 400 years ago. Now Kepler was very blessed. I always think of his relationship to his mentor as the kind of accidental relationship that happened with Rilke. The young Rilke, one of the 20th century's greatest poets, was apprenticed to the great French sculptor Rodin, and was Rodin's secretary, personal private executive secretary for a while. And he learned just by watching the old artist genius Rodin just be himself, he learned what art was all about, how it really happens. Kepler was apprenticed to a very peculiar character, one of the most peculiar characters in science history. His name was Brahe, Tycho Brahe. He was Danish. And Brahe had done some very odd things in his life. He'd gotten into some sword fight one time and he lost the tip of his nose. So he had a metal nose. So he walked around in the 1500s with a metal nose and furs because he was preferentially treated by the Danish royalty. They loved Tycho. He was a wild man to have around. And when he was asked what he really would most like, because we would like to give you something, he said, I'd like an island, of course, of my own. And so they gave him an island off the coast of Denmark, and he named it right away Uraniborg, the ultimate Ur city of the universe. And he set up an observation post because he figured that since he now had his center and had his kingdom, that the whole universe belonged to him, and he wanted to survey his property. So it was a very odd kind of observation place. He had this kind of mechanical sling made, like a engineering tinker toy sling, which he laid himself in. He wanted to be comfortable. I mean, when you're king of the universe, you want to be comfortable when you're surveying your land. And so he had the telescope positioned so that he could lay there in comfort. I don't know what he did with his metal nose. It probably got very cold at night. Some schnapps, maybe. Anyway, he was one of these individuals. Perhaps it was greed, but he wanted all the details on his stuff. And so he took minute observations of the planets. And he logged these for years. So that when Kepler later on was having these fantastic dreams, actually they were like visions. They were like the creative complement of what a migraine headache is. A migraine is a negative thing, and Kepler had the positive version. Hildegard of Bingen also had this kind of quality, where they would see universal structures instantly and then try to figure out what it was that they saw. And so Kepler got into this in terms of the mathematics of planets and the solar system, and he came up with some very weird, odd stuff, except that he had the records of Tycho Brahe's observations to check out, and he finally put together the realization that the planets do not move around the sun. He sort of stared at the pages and he refused to talk about this thing for several years, until finally in 1604, there was a spectacular thing in heaven, a supernova, which is about the most spectacular thing you can see, more spectacular than a great comet. Because suddenly, out of nowhere, a star dominates the heavens. And in 1604, there was a star that sent tremors all through the occult structure of Europe. They thought, this is certainly a sign. What is it a sign of? What's happening? Everyone was calm in the theater section of London because they knew that Shakespeare was producing Hamlet at the time. They thought, well, his crowd of confrères felt that this was worth a little display in heaven. But for Kepler, he brought out a book called The New Astronomy. The New Astronomy. The New Art of Astronomy. Ars Astronomia. And in this book, he developed the mathematical expression that instead of planets moving around the sun, that the sun and the planets were complementaries and they moved around each other, and that the fulcrum and the center of their mutual complementarity dance was a vacant point in space, was a no thing location in pure space. And he had the mathematics and the observations to back it up and prove it. Now, it happened at that time that the Renaissance was being challenged by authorities. Authorities hate to have new ideas obtained too long, and everywhere one found forces ready to crush the Renaissance. In France, the years 1580 to 1630 are a very interesting kind of transition that centers around almost exactly the early 1600s, where you have the Renaissance coming to a dead end in France, and the repressive, reductive qualities of authority come into play in such a way that later on in the century, it began to be challenged by single individuals, and the French Enlightenment became one of the hallmarks of world history. But in between the French Renaissance and the French Enlightenment was a period of reductive, authoritarian quashing, which is almost like taking the temperature of Europe at the time, because that same thing happened everywhere in Europe. In the German language-speaking sections of Europe, this took place as the phenomenon known as the 30 Years' War. And in the 30 Years' War, 1/3 of all the people in Europe were killed by incessant, interminable war. Diaries of the time after the 30 Years' War record traveling from place to place in Germany, and it was so barren that they felt that somehow maybe the Mongols had come again, because there were only scavengers left alive. Whole countrysides depopulated. The same thing happened in intelligence. And so it wasn't until almost 3 generations after Kepler that someone came along and took Kepler up, realized that his complementation was mathematically and observably much more accurate than the old medieval target, thing at the center model of reality. And in fact, it was such a powerful, exuberant quality of recognizing complementation that the idea came in 2 individuals at the very same time, 2 great individuals at the very same time, who had trouble, they never met. They had trouble with each other. And those 2 individuals were Sir Isaac Newton and a man on the continent named Leibniz, the 2 greatest mathematicians of that whole era, perhaps of all time. Newton and Leibniz both understood that Kepler's complementation was not just a mathematical idea, but was the crowning insight concept about how reality works. That this universe, in order to be real, does not present targets of vibrations around a center of things that exist. That this universe is real because there is a dynamic engendered, because a complementation around a mutual nothingness actually obtains. And that when translated into human qualities, it means that 2 human beings together, when they establish a deep complementation, establish between them in a non-thing locus a quality of the real. And that the whole necessity of human life is to recognize that the egotistical target model that I am at the center of my actions and you better watch out is just simply not true. That when human beings come together by 2 or more, that human beings together make a mutual non-thing center whose fulcrum is the true basis upon which a dynamic actually is engendered. And that this is not only a powerful idea, it is an insight which bears what? It bears the weight of exacting provability to any degree, any mathematical degree of fineness that you want to bring to bear on this will disclose again and again that this is the way things are. So that the whole notion of founding an architecture on things at the center, rather than a dynamic space which is shareable, is just simply poor building. Now, when Frank Lloyd Wright, who was very much like Kepler in that he had this ability to have positive migraines, he had the ability to have envisionments that were so startlingly fresh and new and lasting that he was able to carry around this visionary imprint for days, weeks, months, years, decades. And the reason that he had this, if one looks for a reason, if one needs some kind of sociological reason other than just sheer genius, his mother raised him to have this capacity. Frank Lloyd Wright's mother decided when he was still in her womb that he was going to be the greatest architect who ever lived. And so she prepared herself while he was in the womb, then prepared his room into which he was placed as a baby, and then prepared his first education. Now, in the room were hung the prints of Timothy Cole, who did a lot of landscape and fine Gothic English cathedrals. And in his upbringing, she used an educational technique that was developed about the time of Goethe and Beethoven, Schiller, that era of the German Renaissance. The educator who was at the center of this educational development, his name was Froebel, F-R-O-E-B-E-L, Friedrich Froebel. And Froebel, about 100 years ago, was very popular. In the 1890s, one found wonderful books on Froebel, and one finds absolutely nothing after the First World War. There are no books on him. Nobody mentions him. But this was the educational genius that was responsible for unfolding the qualities of the little baby Frank Lloyd Wright, so that by the time he was a child, he was already able to think and see in terms of architecture. Now, Froebel's development of education focused on what he called a series of gifts. That is to say, each child has the qualities of immaturity seeking maturity, has this growth potential, has this sequence through which the child can be developed, which is not only a part of nature, as in universe, as in species, but is a part of reality, of how reality works. And Froebel, being of German mind, tried to find the different levels, the different stages, the stadia at which this would happen. And he found that there were 10. And he called these the gifts. And a series of 10 gifts developed each stage as it occurred, and the very first stage was the ball. A ball about the size of the human hand. That if you give a little baby a ball about the size of its hand, all of the qualities of the universe that have evolved and compacted themselves to become that cream of evolution will be awakened at their beginning. I think sometimes in our time, post Star Trek, we call that a genesis point. Remembering that I always mispronounce it, but I think that the ancient word for Genesis was Bereshith, which is an ongoing process. It's not a beginning at a point, but it means as beginning was occurring. And so even the old Mosaic idea, patiently edited by Jeremiah's dad, Hilkiah, in the 700s BC. But nevertheless, even the ancient Mosaic idea of Genesis is that at its beginning, there's not a point, but there's an ongoingness which achieves a dynamic quality of being able to manifest. That complementations don't just zip around each other, tongues out and eyes crossed, pardon the Hollywood style, but that in this dynamic, actual manifestations occur and are held in structural exactness, in existence, by the dynamic motion. So that structure and motion are related in such a peculiar way that spatiality forms always, so that its quality of appreciation involves three different qualities that can be separate ideas or braided together to make a visionary perspective. And in fact, we can call those three, using an architectural kind of source of metaphor: structure, perspective, and light. And after the break, when we look at some slides, we'll look at the medieval Gothic cathedrals that were the first attempt to consciously express structure, perspective, and light, and which were brought together, unified, in a kind of an interesting dynamic. They were brought together first in what has been called the Renaissance. And the architect who brought them together was one of the great, insightful artists of all time, Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi learned his craft, learned his vision, learned his architecture when he and his young friend Donatello decided that they were, as older teenagers, outgrowing their native Tuscany and needed to go to the big time, so they went to Rome. And they went to Rome with sketchbooks and styluses, and because they were too poor to hire guides, they went to all of the buildings in Rome by themselves. And because they were curious as to just how these buildings were, they took to measuring every single aspect of every building in Rome. And the young Donatello and the young Brunelleschi learned, just like Kepler learned from Tycho, just like Rilke learned from Rodin, just like Frank Lloyd Wright learned from his own developing capacity from Froebel, that when one pays attention to existence in an exacting way, it discloses its structure, and the structure furthers its interiorization through perspective, and that there comes a point of insight, of light, and that allows for the integration of the whole. So that structure, perspective, and light lead to a realization that has a double complement. It creates, in terms of architecture, an architectural space which is the building and has as its natural, real complement the individual space of the person, so that the building and the person mature together at the same time in a complementation around a fulcrum which is shared between them. And so later on, when Frank Lloyd Wright would use a term that's been so sort of misused in such a way as to be almost meaningless at the current academic time, when he would say organic architecture, he meant something extremely profound, something that really, when you can hear it, when you can see it, when you can analyze, when you can observe, and bring all of these capacities together, tie them in a bow instead of a knot. It takes patience to make that bow. But when they're tied in a bow, one finds that there is a complementation between the reality of your person and the existence of this architectural building, whatever it is. A house, a high-rise, a whole city, a planet, a whole star system. One can design, one can compose in such a realistic way that the person, the people, the population occur together. And so a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's writings concern themselves with architecture and with democracy. And there are many academics today who very patiently dismiss it by saying this was very cute 19th century American naivete, when it's exactly the way in which Jefferson talked about architecture and democracy. And when Jefferson wanted to make the point, because he understood people like Kepler and Newton and Leibniz, long before there was someone like Froebel or Frank Lloyd Wright, when Jefferson wanted to make the existence of this idea real, he built Monticello. And Monticello has, in all of its design and qualities, the universe in miniature. And right at the center of Monticello, where one would expect there to be a thing, there is a space. Because all of the lands of Monticello, all the farmlands, all the orchards, everything rises up the hill to the house, and everything in the house, all of its structure and design, rises to the center top of the house where there's this dome. And in that dome, there's nothing. Bare polished wood, and the inside of the dome was painted sky blue. And when Jefferson stood in the dome of Monticello, he was like a brilliant child as a compliment to someone like Tycho Brahe, who was trying to survey the things of his domain. Jefferson was inhabiting the central space of the real. The realized cranium of the completely open house. And in order to present this in a larger version, because he saw that the country that was being made, the United States of America, which was not based, incidentally, in those decades on the Constitution, but was based upon the dynamic between Jefferson and Madison on one hand, and between Alexander Hamilton and John Adams on the other. And the Jefferson-Madison group won out. And the United States that was made was not based on the Constitution, but was based upon engendering the kind of persons who were real at the same time that the architecture of Monticello, but in the largest sense, the architecture of the land the landscape that became the territory, the geography of the United States. And in order to recast what had been 13 colonies, Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, in one fell swoop, extended what had been a colonial fiefdom federation to something that spanned from ocean to ocean and literally was wide open. This landscape, this openness, this continental dome was engendered at the same time as setting free all the capacities of several millions of people. So that in American history, if you look at that couple of decades that came after Jefferson and Madison were finished, they're called the fabulous 40s, or the happy decade. And the United States simply outstripped every country, every nationality, every political entity in history in that time period. The difference between the United States of 1800 and the United States of 1850 in that 50 years is phenomenal, is unbelievable. And by 1860, just 10 years later, the United States was able to fight the first terrifying modern war. The Civil War is a kind of a war which is exactly what the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War were. The Civil War was the first modern war, in that there was no limit to the destructive capacity that could be brought to bear. The casualties of the American Civil War were higher than the American casualties in World War II in numbers of dead. Over 1 million men died in the Civil War. The destructive power was colossal. And it occurred because of a breakdown in the dynamic between individuals and land, between the territory of the United States as a complementation to the quality of the individuals who were there, because their reality was tied together. So that if one broke down, the other broke down also. If either broke down, the other broke down. And the Civil War was such a catastrophic shredding of the finest flower of the real that the only individual who understood it at the time, Abraham Lincoln, was hard-pressed to be able to find the kind of language to describe to others what it was that he saw. And it was only about 10 years after the death of Lincoln that another person finally got what Jefferson, what Lincoln, what was real about the United States, about its people and its land, in a vast visionary complementation. And that third person that finally understood that was Walt Whitman. Not the Walt Whitman of Leaves of Grass, but the Walt Whitman of his essays about democracy. This whole quality is the legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright. He comes out of this ensemble. He comes out of this development, out of this matrix, if we could say. And he focuses both integrally and differentially all of the ideas, all of the images, all of the themes of this entire tradition. So that Wright is really somebody extraordinary. He is not just an architect. He is not just a character, but indeed he is almost like a natural force that's brought to bear in such a way that it penetrates through to consciousness. Now, I had outlined a number of things to read to you, but I think I would like to just focus on one. This is from one of our texts. The complementary text to the Henry Moore book is Frank Lloyd Wright's Writings and Buildings. And in here, on page 84, is a little thing called The Sovereignty of the Individual. And he wrote this in 1910, and he wrote it not to be published in the United States, but to be published in Germany, in Berlin of 1910, because the first real appreciative monograph on Frank Lloyd Wright was by the Germans in Berlin. A book was brought out, and The Sovereignty of the Individual was Wright's contribution to a Europe which he saw completely floundering with regressive ideation that was heading for a terminal limbo. And in fact, just 4 years after this, World War I broke out. And as Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize speech of 1954, he pointed out that the world has been in constant war since 1914, that has never ended, that there were just various cycles of one long war lasting generations, and that the basic quality of this war was to intimidate individuals so that they will not mature, they will not dare to mature, and that they will cower back into instinctual aggregates and groups, so that those clever enough to manipulate best would take over, and we would have no more war because we'll let them run us as long as they let us live. Faulkner in his Nobel Prize speech, because he was also in the tradition of Jefferson. All of Faulkner's novels take place in a symbolic land called Jefferson County, Yoknepa County, Jefferson. And he's very much like Frank Lloyd Wright. He's very much like Lincoln and Whitman. He belongs in this tradition. It has a very fine pedigree, which I've traced over the last 30 years. And sometime I'll put it out in a volume, in a book. It has a pedigree that includes Newton and Leibniz and Kepler and a number of individuals. Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech said, the first thing that we must face is fear. That fear is the most base of all conditions for a person. And to recognize that fear is everything that we shun. We are wise about fear, but to accept fear for what it is and put it aside, that this is the kind of courage of the heart that the person, the individual, needs. Here's Wright in 1910, writing to a Berlin which was really the center of the continental Europe at the time. In 1910, Paris might have been a very artistic center, and London, the center of the British Empire, but continental Europe was really founded and focused on the power of Berlin. He writes in here about the great development in the Renaissance, especially about the development of the architecture of people like Brunelleschi and the architect Bramante who followed him, and the architect Michelangelo who followed him, and the architect engineer Leonardo. All of these individuals, Frank Lloyd Wright then says, from the flaming souls of these brilliant Italians were lighted myriads of French, German, Spanish, English, and many other lesser flames. They flourished, flickered feebly for a time, to soon smolder in sensuality and the extravagance of later periods until extinguished in banal architecture like the Rococo or nondescript structures such as the Louvre, and of Louis and the Paris Beaux-Arts. This applies to buildings more or less, shall we say, quote, professional embodiments of cultured striving for the beautiful. The beautiful with a capital B. He writes, I mean those buildings which were good school performances, buildings seeking consciously trying to be beautiful, regardless. Here as elsewhere, nevertheless, the true basis for any serious study of the art of architecture still lies in those indigenous structures. What those humble buildings everywhere that people build for themselves, that humble, self-built buildings are to architecture what folklore is to great world literature. Because in these humble structures, in these peopled beginnings, one finds the presence of the true person, the within, as Frank Lloyd Wright would say later on. And that it's out of the within that a true resonance occurs. And instead of having a false illusion target as resonances of some thing, which is always a projection, is never there. Instead of having the target resonance of a projected illusion, one has a building which has come out of a within, so that the building and that within occur together at the same time. This is an organic architecture. So that the building occurs at the same frequency at which human beings are real. That the building and the persons are real together. And not only can you build something then called the natural house, but you can build something called the living city. Can you imagine a city of several million people that's alive because its reality is coexistent, complementarity, a complementarity with the population of the people who inhabit it, who live in it. This is a new world, not seen in large scale, but possible because it's been individually done many times. At the end of his life, Jefferson, in trying to demonstrate, because he could see that people didn't understand Monticello at all, the Capitol dome, instead of being a beautiful sky blue open place where the legislatures and the executive branch and the judicial could come and gain a resonance of sustenance, was just simply a spire of power. And that's all it's become. That's all it is today. And Jefferson, in trying to give another example, built a larger version of Monticello, this time not a house for a family, for an individual, but this time a house of learning. He built the University of Virginia, just down the hill from Monticello. You can see it from Monticello. Just like from the University of Virginia, you can see Monticello up on the hill. And he put the domed structure in the front of a pair of colonnaded phase form structures, and this ninefold quality became the original University of Virginia. In order to show that all the resonances of this were of a single matrix pattern, Jefferson chose the library, he chose the faculty, he designed the entire structure, and then invited the first student population to come and inhabit it. And the University of Virginia was like a large scale, like a broadcast version of Monticello. He was in his early 80s at the time, and of course was unable to live longer. Had he been blessed with another 20 years of life, the 100-year-old Jefferson would have been rebuilding the capital of the country, probably. Frank Lloyd Wright took this kind of quality seriously. And in The Sovereignty of the Individual, to Berlin in 1910, he wrote, "Though our intelligence may in no wise prove beauty, the result of these harmonious internal conditions, that which through the ages appeals to our instinct as beautiful, we may realize, does not ignore these basic elements of law and order, nor does it take long to establish in our minds the fact that no lasting beauty ever does ignore them. They are ever-present elements, or are the actual conditions of the existence of beauty. From the study of the forms or styles which mankind has considered beautiful, we see those living longest do in greatest measure fulfill these basic conditions. That anything grows is no concern of ours, because the quality we call life itself is beyond us. It really is mystical. We are not necessarily concerned with that initial gift of life, but with beauty, its essence, as for us the most mysterious quality of life." I notice that the machines are kicking off, and so we'll let them dictate our time for a little bit longer. We'll take a break. And during the break, I will set up the Henry Moore slides from last week and just run them. So if some of you missed that, you can see the Henry Moore slides. And then when you come back in from the break, we'll put the carousel with the Frank Lloyd Wright slides in, and we'll go through those. Now with Wright, I've tried to choose two kinds of buildings to start off with, and next week we'll do more. But the two buildings that I chose, one is the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, and the other is Falling Water in Pennsylvania. One is a house, and the other is a hotel. One is for a family, and the other are for whatever visiting humanity would come together at any given time. I think this is the best way to begin with Wright. And next week we'll take a look at some other aspects. So let's take a break now, and we'll set up the slides. And you can see the Moore slides if you haven't. Bring your coffee in if you like, and your rolls. I've arranged the slides initially so that we can develop a little bit of architectural eye. Let's talk about three things together. Let's use this image and talk about structure. Next image. Let's use this image and talk about perspective. We need to focus it just a touch. Yeah. Okay, structure and perspective. And then the third image. Next. Light. Light. Structure, perspective, light. All right, now let's look at the next sequence of 6 slides, and we'll have 2 slides on each of these 3. Okay, the next slide. First, Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay, structure. This is from the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which was contemporaneous with the First World War. He began designing it in 1915, began building it in 1917. It opened officially, I think, in 1922. It went for 45 years, and then the pollution of Tokyo's air just simply ate into the building structure. they put a subway under one of the wings, and some of the basic foundations collapsed. And people generally were saying we need to have some kind of new aesthetic, let's get rid of it. And so it was torn down, I believe, in the late 60s. Structure. Notice here, always in Wright, there's a delineation that has this quality that you can almost count. It's like counting. Remember a concept that we used last year when we were talking about how ritual flames into language and how literacy is presaged by numeracy. Numeracy comes before literacy. And that literally number, counting, as a sequencing, that sequencing of counting is very, very important to build some of the qualities on which sentences and paragraphs and literary structures are built. I'm sure many of you have seen Sesame Street, where Big Bird has the little kids count, and some segment of a program be brought to you by the number 3. Or today we're being sponsored by the number 8, something like that. Counting. This kind of development where these two are not equal, but these two together have some relationship with this, that somehow this square has a quality which is related to this square, and that somehow these two together, this square and this kind of rectangle, when brought together, make a rectangle, and that rectangle is very much like this kind of rectangle, and that somehow there's a composition here, which if one had the time, one could make an exacting count and find that there was a numerical sequencing compositional order. For instance, in Dallas, Texas, the Kalita Humphreys Theater Center is all built on 30-degree angles. The entire building is 30-degree angles. And you don't notice that at first. But when someone points that out to you, or if there is someone there to point it out to you, and you're able to compose your eye on 30 degrees, suddenly you look at the Kalita Humphreys Theater building and it comes alive. Or like the Marin County Civic Center, one of Frank Lloyd Wright's last great buildings in San Rafael, California. It was meant to be seen at the pace of walking, about 2 miles per hour. So that when you look at photographs of the building and the complex, you don't quite get the building. But when you walk in it at the pace of 2 miles an hour, the whole building spreads its wings and performs like a ballet. So that with Wright's architecture, one has to see that structure has a numeracy to it, which translates into the perspective, which has a quality of developing into light, interiorizing into space, into understanding. And that this continuity characterizes, that all of these together forming a continuity characterize organic architecture. So that Wright coined the phrase in order to try and get it across to a public that refused to understand. He coined the term streamlined. Something becomes streamlined when stream of consciousness participates in the continuity of the experience of the building, meaning that you're in the building, and your experience and the building's experience together form a stream of continuity. It isn't just that forms become streamlined, it's that the experience of the architecture becomes a stream of continuity and comes alive. You and the building together make life happen. And the essence of that life is beauty, which then can manifest. Okay, so structure. Next slide, also structure. Again, notice here that just even a cursory look, one can see that repetitions are not, we have to focus that. That's not in focus. Just a little bit forward, yeah. There we are. Notice that with repetitions, if it's done in the right way, you get an accrual of energy. Energy accrues. So that as you raise up, one becomes aware that height, that perspective here with structure is building it's like a tension. Bucky Fuller invented the word tensegrity in order to carry this idea. Tensegrity is very, very akin to, in engineering, in dome engineering, very akin to what Wright called continuity. Tensegrity, continuity. But it takes our participation with the building, with the architecture, to bring this through. These are all Imperial Hotel. Okay, we had two structured. Now let's go to two perspective. So that the building, in this case the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, the building had qualities where structure bled into perspective on almost every level of proportion, from the building as a whole, the hotel as a whole, to any given area of the hotel, to any particular spot where anybody would stand or where anybody would move, so that the only way to convey this would be to use the idea of a crystal, where structure and perspective are interrelated. They have a continuity, they have a tensegrity, so involved with each other, but only disclosed when there's someone there to disclose it, to be there with it. Okay, next one, also perspective. The perspective. The way in which perspective now is a continuity between structure and light. Okay, the next two slides emphasizing light. The quality of a lighted space, where space is illuminated, literally. Next slide. Now, when Wright was designing this kind of a wall in 1914, there were no places that had this in the world. And one of Wright's leading ideas at the time, he said, we have to re-experience ourselves and re-experience architecture, re-experience what buildings can be. Because we have new materials. We have glass, we have concrete, we have steel, we have plastics. And I think he said one time in reply to a questionnaire, I think it was the young Hugh Downs, he said, you know, if the Greeks had had steel and glass and concrete, we wouldn't be doing any thinking right now. We would know how to build. But these are new materials, and we have to find a way in which we are real with them. And this is what architecture is all about. And so our age, our time, is an exploration of new forms, because we suddenly have a whole new palette to work with. Next slide, please. Okay, we're back to structure. We're going to do two slides now on structure, then two on perspective, then two on light. I'm separating them so that we can get used to some kind of a compositional triad here. Okay, structure, these are foundations of the Imperial Hotel. Even in the foundations, you can see the way in which structure plays and maintains its accruing repetitiveness, but a repetitiveness that becomes dynamic into a stream of flow, a continuity. Next slide, please. This becomes very complex. In the Imperial Hotel, when structure was at last released into large-scale compositions, Wright could envision the play of detail in such a complexity that it takes quite a while to be able to just see what's going on here. And this, of course, was very early in the game. Wright was designing buildings for another 40 years almost and became astronomically great at the complexity, especially of curved structures, later in his life. When you factor in curved structures into this kind of composition. Now you'll see later on that Kandinsky is very much a genius at visioning in this way. We'll bring some of Kandinsky in next week with some of Wright's designs. The next slide. Looks like it's in backwards. Unless it's written in, no, the Japanese is down below. This was a pond, a reflecting pond. And this was the front entrance to the Imperial Hotel. The next slide, please. Perspective. Perspective. Notice a lot of Japanese elements are factored in. Before he built the Imperial Hotel, before he started designing this in 1914, Wright, for about 25 years, was the world's greatest collector of Japanese prints. Frank Lloyd Wright bequeathed the largest, best collection of Japanese prints in the world. He wrote a book on Japanese prints, especially Hiroshige. He said one of the tests of an original Hiroshige, would you want to eat it? That it has quality of edibility, that the colors, the forms are delectable. One is reminded of the Vaughan Williams composition, Shepherds of the Delectable Mountains. When something is organic, when it's alive, when we participate with it in a realistic, humane, heart-warmed way, it's like soup's on. It's like there's an edible quality. There's a banquet. And as Plato, in his dialogue, The Symposium, points out, it's only at this level of being at the same banquet together that human beings can learn about each other in a personable way. It's only when we're ready to eat together, it's only when that communion level of participation together is achieved that a transformation is shareable and the focus of no place, like an Italian family meal, is available for all. All of us can reach into that center of no focus together. It's this kind of transcendent communion meal that is the true sacrament. And to reduce it down to any kind of doctrinaire conceptuality is to miss it completely, to miss the event. One is reminded of a film by Louis Buñuel, Viridiana, where he has the beggar's Last Supper, which is one of the most joyous episodes in all of cinema history, because you experience there the human delectability of all these oddball characters being able to eat together in some temporary hiatus of the social structure that would keep them out on the streets hungry. They are just for a split hour able to come into this wonderful mansion and gobble up all the great food together. They're going to have to leave later. It's this kind of equality that art is. And in this way, art is indispensable to a democracy. Absolutely indispensable. Just as the artist makes art, art makes it possible for there to be a people on a differential level. You can have people on a tribal level with myth, but you cannot have a people on a differential level without art. Next slide, please. Perspective. Next slide, please. Light. There's a kind of a shimmering glow to the forms when they're in focus. The whole structure of the Imperial Hotel main lobby, with its perspective, its repetitions, its development. And we'll talk about the development of Renaissance perspective next week also, and how it lends a new quality of mind, a differential quality of mind that's not there on the tribal level. Not there on the tribal level. A mythic structure does not have perspective, whereas an artistic structure always has a perspective. And in the hands of a great artist like Wright, leads into light. Next slide, please. The incredible way in which a single line, a defining line of the Imperial Hotel, progressively grows with its structure, its perspective, its massive form, its penetration of light. Next slide, please. So that when one comes back to the building, back to any detail, one begins to find again and again in these cycles, in this ecology of visual return, this cycle of architectural experience, the experience of you in the building, one begins to find that there is a language of form embedded in the structure, expressed in the perspective, transcendent in the light, the very space of the building itself. Ask what was the most real material in the building, Wright said, the space of the building, the experience of the building. The next slide. Look how light discloses structure and perspective and itself. And one becomes sensitized to this. One becomes sensitive to this. Recalibrated is a good term to this. A work of art recalibrates us to its universe. That's the way an esthetician would talk. Every work of art is a universe of its own. And all works of art share the same cosmos. One has to get used to living in and living with, being real in terms of, in a complementation to, any given work of art. You have to get acquainted with it. Louis Sullivan bending over the young Frank Lloyd Wright one time when he was working as a 19-year-old in Chicago. He said, "Wright, you can render pretty well, but you haven't yet learned that behind every building that you see is someone that you don't see, namely the architect. Every building that's worthwhile is an expression of the architect. And he is there, or she is there, in the building. And the way to get to know them is to get to know the building. You have to make friends with a building. At that time, Sullivan was at the peak of his powers. He was doing the Wainwright building, which was a colossal jump in comprehension of modern skyscraper building. Next slide, please. The way in which the vegetation complements the structure becomes a hallmark of Frank Lloyd Wright. In all of his later renderings, you always find large, huge bowls with cascading foliage, with vegetation interpenetrating together. Next slide, please. The experience of being anywhere in the Imperial Hotel became then an exercise in composing one's relationality to the architecture, to the building itself, inside and outside. Next slide, please. He began at this time making tremendous developments of large-scale stained glass and leaded glass. There's recently a great monograph on the stained glass of Frank Lloyd Wright. Became very interested in this, and the compositions began to be very complicated and beautifully done. Here in the Imperial Hotel, you can see this quality of the detail merging into a complexity, allowing for the interpenetration. One used to say inner and outer, but it's not the inner of the building with the outer of nature. It is also the inner of yourself and the experience of the outer of the architecture and its landscape together. So the interpenetration is on many levels. Next slide. I took this slide in Dallas a long time ago of the approaches to one of the bathrooms in the Kalita Humphreys Theater, and it just seemed to show in this out-of-the-way back space this beautiful handling of all the facets in the building. It was almost like this was a visual key that if one could understand the relationalities here, you could then go out away from the bathroom and look at the structure as a whole. This is a quality that's there in Wright's buildings. Once you understand, once you have not isolated, not analyzed, but once you, and not identified, but once you've come to an integral of the symbolic proportion and ratios that are operating in a Wright building, you then can open up the experience of being in the architecture and it will fly. Next slide, please. The easiest building in the world to fly in is Falling Water, a house built in 1936. A house built over a waterfall. La Casa sulla Cascata. I think that's the Italian phrase used for it. La Casa sulla Cascata, the house on the waterfall. It's a blending of a natural site, a little stream called Bear Run in southwestern Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. Has a slight waterfall over some old rock. And Wright built this structure. Let's see the next slide. This house. One of the qualities, one of the structural qualities here is that the rock in this area of southwestern Pennsylvania has these slate-like layers. And so again and again in Falling Water, you have the repetition building to accrual of layers, gaining strength. And that the layers are able to hold their tensegrity even when one layer, like the top layer, would be extended out, cantilevered out. That any given layer, let's say the top layer, is such a part of the structure of the whole rock that the top level can be jutted out and will hold itself. You don't have to have a post and beam to hold it up. It is held much like he used to say the hand and the arm coming out from the central skeletal structure to cantilever something out if it's organically a part of the existing structure. He said like a tree with its branches coming out is a cantilevered structure. Here the house has these cantilevered verandas, several of them, so that a great deal of the space of the house are in between large cream white concrete strata that jut out into the forested surroundings. And it does several things at once. It gives you light in a very interesting kind of interplay. It also allows for the sound of the waterfall to be echoed and bounced and carried inside to the house, so that one gets the sound of the waterfall in various ratioed sounds. And because there are echoing and rebounding and audio overlays, there are times when the waterfall composes a symphonic white sound that you can miss unless you tune your ear to hear it. And when you have tuned your ear to hear it, the house's interior space becomes a music, a real water music, a waterfall music. La casa sola cascada. The house, not only on the waterfall, but the house as a part of the waterfall. It is a waterfall itself. The light cascading in, the sound cascading in, the space cascading in, one's architectural experience cascading. And the longer one is in a structure in this way, the more that it accrues and builds a quality. The only other house in the world that has that quality is the Gamble House in Pasadena, the Green and Green Gamble House. The basic symbolic motif of the Gamble House is the Japanese cloud motif. A plane which has one kind of flattened dome, very, very flattened dome structure, so that you have this kind. It's like a flattened Greek letter omega. And once one symbolically cues your emotional kinesthetic experience to that cloud motif, and you experience the building, the Gamble House will have you literally walking, scuffing clouds when you come out. Falling water is like that. You come out and you are a part of that waterfall. That house has transmitted to you the light, the sound, the space, the reality of the waterfall. The house is, in a very real way, a civilized extension of the waterfall, which includes the human experience of anyone who lives or visits in that house. And so Wright is a very great magician, if we can put it this way. He took nature and showed how its integration in art is so powerful and so complementarity bound with our reality that whatever integration and transformations have taken place in nature and have come to be embodied in a work of art, they transmit them directly to our person so that we get a ideational, a symbolic, a kinesthetic, a movement composition of nature. And we experience this, we inhabit this. Next slide, please. This is one of the great beams that has been bent around this tree to allow this tree to remain there. Right? Said it didn't interrupt the design of the building at all. In fact, it fit in with it. Next slide, please. Remember, okay, there were the strata of the rock native to the site of this house, but also the strata, like in the Imperial Hotel, like in a lot of Wright's architecture, there is this numerical layering, ordering, which accrues and builds energy. One of the earliest symbols of this in the world was about 5,000 years ago, the Egyptian symbol called the Djed, D-J-E-D, the Djed. And when you see it, it's like a little pillar. It's like one of those outside garden lights. It's a pillar that has 4 little circles around it with a little domed cap. And when you see the Egyptian hieroglyph for Djed, that means the condensation of energy. I had a engineering mystic one time tell me, he said, for all the world, this looks like an electricity condenser. He said, did the ancient Egyptians have electricity? Did they know about it? I said, I'm not aware that they did. But he said, with this kind of a structure, it would make a condensed electrical energy. All you would have to do is hook up some diodes to this and have a little bit of a tungsten bulb, and you would have light. So the most primordial of all hieroglyphic symbols, that means condensation of energy to make light. Wright's architecture has this in a natural and yet very traditional wisdom way. His buildings accrue energy. Next slide. This is a shot from another angle. This is that same sculpture that we were looking at. And here is a little single spurt of water. This single spurt of water has the basic measurement of the sound of the waterfall reduced to a level of like 1. So if you can hear this, you can then begin to calibrate for yourself in terms of audio kinesthetics the sound potential of the waterfall, and then begin to hear it in the house. The house is a musical instrument which is being played by the waterfall. And this is the calibration of it here. Hence the sculpture is put here, gesturing. Let's go back one. Let's go back to the slide that shows where that, gesturing is to say, here is where one can begin to hear this house. This is where it is. And of course, this bridge work here, going over Bear Run, this is the drive that comes to approach the house. This is how you approach the house from, say, Pittsburgh or someplace like that, and you drive out in the countryside, come into the woods. You would come into the house driving across that. So right away there at that place, at that juncture, is the beginning of the pitch pipe to tune your ear to hear the waterfall house. Next slide. And next slide, please. A bodhisattva head is placed on a slate floor of one of these decks and terraces just above where one has that calibration. This is the calibration of presence. This is the calibration of a meditative focus. And if you've been meditating or contemplating enough in your life, you know that there can be no meditation with the ego. The ego always nominates something to represent itself to be the center of attention. It has only one flag that it waves, and the flag reads, me. Me. Whereas in meditation, one discovers that there's no me. Yes, the experience is quite real and you are there, but the me is not there. The me is holding this little pennant and is down in the locker room swearing. Next slide, please. So that the calibration of presence is right here off in a small balcony, right here off the place where the sleeping quarters, the master bedroom, as we would say, so that there's a quality here that when you want to index this house, those people who live here, for whom this house is built, they can come out of their bedroom onto this terrace and focus their meditative sensibility to themselves, and just below them is the beginning pitch pipe key to sensitize themselves to the waterfall and the house. The next slide, please. Calm and repose. Next slide, please. So that the house becomes so integral with the landscape at that exact place that once you have experienced that house, once your experience has streamlined itself with that house, the whole landscape now is a well-known acquaintance of yours. And Wright says, at that point you realize that that house belongs there. It is real there. It has not been superimposed on that landscape. It has grown out of that landscape and expresses in a differential way such that the house and the landscape and you are wedded forever. Not blended, not mixed. That term wedded, that you belong together. This is what makes it real. And Wright said of this, is one of his favorite phrases, when architecture is experienced personally, you can't imagine that house being any other place than where it is. It's not a real estate hype. Not just an aesthetic statement, but it's like an indexing that when you have joined that house in that place to that degree of continuity, of flowing together, your reality is established forever. There's no way. Of course, you can tear down the house. You can destroy the site. But as long as that house and that site and you last and exist, this is an eternal moment. Next slide. Falling water seems to blend into the forest at this point, almost as if it were a natural occurrence. Or one might almost say that nature has raised itself up to supernatural pyrotechnics, and that's what the house is. Next slide. From that quality, one can then come into play with the architecture in such a way that the composition of it begins to play. And this is where art really spreads its wings. When the play element, when you have joined and wedded that house and that environment to the extent that you're all a continuity, then the play of nature, the play of the house becomes your play. And when you play, the house plays with you. Nature plays with you. And you walk around on this sunny summer day, and you smilingly start to look and see the shadows and the light, the shadows of the leaves of 4 or 5 dozen trees, waving 8,000 or 9,000 leaves together, and each shadow playing. All of it becomes a dance, a ballet, which is real, and you become the composer. The house plays with you. The nature plays with you. That whole forest plays with you. They did a video with the son of the builders, the Kaufmans, Edgar Kaufman Jr. And he said, I just want to say that growing up in this house led me to donate this house to the public, to the world, to the architecturally sensitive people of the world, because in reality, once you have lived in this house, you realize that anybody who can live there, it belongs to them. Anyone who can raise themselves to that architectural participation, this is their house also. And when he donated the house as an architectural monument, one of the little stipulations that was first there is that he got to give tours to people for a while, just become like a docent, just to get their juices going so that they could realize that this is not a place that you come to, but this is a focus where you can be. And that this house becomes yours also. Next slide, please. Notice the slight accent, the slight autumnal accent of the window frames against the natural rock. Next slide, please. And the larger quality of those rock strata, those window spaces, here in a cantilevered structural element coming out like a screen. And down below here, you can see another balcony. The next slide, please. Everywhere, the composition of geometry and the fractal play of nature combine together so that you have the most incredible displays of natural fractal forms, like a leaf. If you look at the vein system of a leaf, is a natural fractal form. And the way leaves mass themselves together on a branch. And the shadowings of those against the building and the movement of the leaves themselves. All of this begins to sing. It's literally like a mystical choir of elements and faculties. Next slide, please. So that playful composition is the normal reality of a work of architecture. And Falling Water is one of the best structures in the world to disclose this. Next slide, please. The interior Falling Water now in the next few slides, just to notice, try and imagine yourself, project yourself, be in that room, and then allow your sensitivity to go out. And we'll watch the next 5 or 6 slides, and they'll all be examples of this. Notice the floor. Notice the structuring here of the rock. Notice the window structuring. Notice even the lights in the ceiling. Notice the trees outside. There's an accrual of compositional energy that dynamically fuels the play. And the play comes out in terms of freedom. Next slide. And the next. The central fireplace. This is native rock. This is a part of the native rock left in the, so that the living room slate floor was pushed against the natural rock so that the fireplace is literally carved out onto part of the rocky ledge. And this is a great big cauldron to cook for everybody that swings in. Next slide. The corner of the master bedroom for Mrs. Kaufman to sit and compose herself in the morning, do her letters. Next slide. We're going to end with this one because our time is running out. We'll come back next week. We'll look at these and some others. Notice the quality here. Look first at structure. Now look at perspective. Shift to perspective. Be aware that you're going from structure to perspective, and then let light occur. Then experience all three of them together, flowing in continuity. Structure, perspective, light. This is the best that we can do with slides of the house itself works. Now, there's not a chance to go to Falling Water over the weekend, but there is a house available here in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles. It's the Barnsdale House. And if you take yourself up to see the Barnsdale House is very close to Falling Water in its capacity. It's being restored. And I think at least it would give you the experience of a Wright house where the reality of the architecture invites you to participate into it. Try looking at the Barnsdale House in terms of structure first, then let it bleed into perspective, and then walk through the place again if you can, and just let the light occur. And you'll get some idea, at least, some basic experience. If you can do that sometime during the next week, I'll bring in some slides and try to make some more advanced points about Wright's architecture and about Moore's sculpture. So next week we'll put Moore and Wright together, and we'll talk about the holes of Henry Moore being protective and the spaces of Wright being differential. These two artists, who are almost contemporaries, both did a great service to this time of travail. Both of them showed the way in which a new civilization, or if you like to say a new stage of civilization, but actually a completely new civilization, can come out of the travail of the 20th century. But that new civilization needs art, not just as its linchpin to keep the pattern on the axle, but it needs it for the driver, the charioteer. Art is not just the linchpin, but is also the charioteer. The only civilization that will be able to survive at higher levels actually needs transcendent people to be there. And those transcendent people must live the continuity of the objects which they are making and surrounding themselves. As long as man is still tribally using metal as simply tools for survival or for warfare, there's no way that we can address ourselves to a dissolving acid which simply absorbs all of those kinds of relationalities. That dissolving acid is known as history. The process of history is like an aqua regia. It takes every metal tool known and dissolves them and makes them unworkable. They simply will not work. We have to have new relationalities, new proportions, new tools. And with those, we can cross the ocean of history and come out on the high side. The high side being a realistic cosmos, which is then open to our freedom. More next week. Thank you.